Happy Friday. Hope everybody's getting ready for the long weekend. But before you do, we have some business to attend to. And the topic of the day, marketing research. Now, our last class, we took a look at segmentation and targeting. All of that's based upon the type of marketing research we do as a company. So what we want to do today is, as I fix my collar, we want to talk about marketing research. Now, I'm also going to talk about marketing research in terms of what I refer to as market validation. Market validation says what you've gone out is proved a market exists for the product you're interested in. That's really important if you're bringing a new product to market. But market validation, not so much if you're an already existing company. There, marketing research is a much more important component. And we'll discuss kind of both of them as we go through today. Why do we do marketing research? Well, one is we want to improve decision making. The best thing to do with decision making is we want to make sure we have all the information so we know who we're targeting, what we're measuring, and how well we're doing. And that really comes from solid market research. Some of that research is done before we go into the field, and some of that's done afterwards. So if we're trying to track our market share, for example, that's afterwards. Knowing our market share allows us to determine whether or not we need to spend more on promotions or we need to do something else in terms of how we distribute the product so that more customers are aware of us and buy the product. Second of all, we want to be able to trace problems. So if if your sales are down, you want to know why. Now, just knowing sales are down really doesn't tell you much. So by doing marketing research, you can find out if the sales are down because of a new competitor coming into the market that we didn't know about. We might find out that our pricing now is perceived as too high, or it could be too low, and people now are thinking we're lower quality, so they're not buying from us anymore. Or it could be something else. So what we want to do is trace what the problem is. Let's use our market share example. About 20 years ago, my primary job was working with McDonald's in Canada to track their market share in the prairies. And every month we'd run a study to find out what kind of market share McDonald's had in, at the time, the three main areas of the quick service restaurant chain's interest. That was the breakfast market, the lunch market, and the dinner market. Now, if they were not number one in each one of those segments, they'd want to know why. And usually it came down to the fact that their primary competitor at the time in the Canadian market was issuing a coupon. So what they would do is turn around and the next month they'd have a coupon in the market so they'd get their share back up. But they wanted to know why their share was down. Okay? So that's understanding and tracing problems. The third reason is you want to understand your relationships with consumers. Remember yesterday we talked about positioning. And we talked about figuring out what consumers thought were important and then making sure we position nicely on those variables using our product features to convey a benefit the customer was looking for. What we want to know is, what's our relationship with consumers? Do they see us as providing those important attributes, those important positioning pieces we need to know? Do they see us as trustworthy? So all the things that are associated with brand relationship come in here. So we want to be able to test that. Where do we sit? Okay. Another example from my past. One of the things that I worked on in addition to McDonald's was testing new agricultural chemical product coming to market. And what we knew was if we ever wanted to get somebody's attention, we'd always want to picture our product being used with John Deere equipment, because John Deere equipment had a very strong relationship with our customer base. It was seen as the pinnacle. And if somebody was using John Deere equipment in our product had to be equally good to the Deere product. How did we find that out? We just tested. We asked what they liked in terms of farm equipment. And that allowed us to figure out what to put in the commercials. Hugely successful when we brought out our Liberty Link product back in the 90s. It also helps gauge satisfaction levels. You've all gone to a restaurant or to a store, and at the bottom of the cash register receipt, there's this take the survey and get blank. $5 off your next visit, a free appetizer, gift certificate, whatever it is. Well, what the company's trying to do at that point is figure out what your satisfaction level is with them. And if it's not hitting a percentage they want to know why. So they're going to look at what's our satisfaction level, why did we get that? And if they see they're weak in a particular area, they want to go and correct that. And if they're really strong, they can turn around and use that in their promotional campaign. So that really helps us gauge the value of the goods as well as the satisfaction level, okay? The marketing research process, which we're going to talk about throughout this chapter, consists of 7 steps. The first step is we want to identify and formulate the problem we're going after. So what's the issue that we're going after with this particular study? Is this something we're trying to gauge? Is there a market for this product? Are we trying to gauge what our share is? Are we looking to see what our satisfaction level is? Are we looking to see how competitors are ranked? We need to define that. So we need to understand what the problem is we're measuring. That's the first step. So we have to be very careful and very specific when we identify a problem. The next thing we need to do is figure out what kind of research we're going to do. Now that always begins with a secondary research study. And what you're looking for in that secondary research study is, has somebody else identified the same problem that you're looking for? And if they have, what have they found? Because you can use that information to help formulate your primary research study. The other thing is it serves as a sober second thought that verifies that what you think of as a problem actually is. So the first thing you want to do is go out, gather some secondary research, and we're going to talk about that in more detail in a few minutes. Then figure out what your primary research is going to look like. Earlier on, I talked about the concept of market validation. Market validation consists of 2 levels. Market validation 1 is always secondary research. What you want to do is figure out, when you're bringing a new product to market, is the opportunity you see something that is a broad opportunity. Remember, we talked about that? It has to be sustainable. It has to be accessible. It has to be large enough we can make a profit. So what we want to do is we need to make sure that when we're targeting a market, other people see it as a large enough market. And as we go through the rest of the exercise, I'm going to use a specific example for you. Okay? Next up, you have to specify the sampling procedures. How are you going to select, how will you select the people to take part in your research study? Is this going to be a convenience sample? I'm going to ask 10 friends, or are you going to do something that's much more structured? The problem with asking 10 friends is it tends to skew your data because they tend to think like you, and they probably don't want to upset you either. So they're going to listen carefully and answer the way they think you want them to answer, not the greatest research. The other way is you do some sort of sampling system, random sampling, mall intercepts, whatever it is, to come up with the number of people you want in your study. And you do it statistically so that you sample enough people that you've got a good enough idea about what the market wants. Okay? In market validation 2, which is when we go and do primary research, the one thing we say is you need to identify at least 100 customers who will buy the product you described and tell you they'll buy it for the price you're proposing. What that will teach you is how big the sales funnel is and how many levels you're going to have to go through. Sometimes to get 100 people to say they're going to buy the product, you need to talk to 10,000 potential customers. That's right, 10,000. That's a huge number. But it's what you have to do in marketing research. Once you've got your study set up, you go and collect the primary data. So remember when I said I did the McDonald's survey in Canada? We used to survey 400 people a month to get our data. Now, to get those 400 people, we probably made about 10,000 phone calls, all right? And the reason why we had to make so many phone calls is people weren't home, people refused to answer, people didn't fall into what we were looking for, okay? They were too old, they were too young, they were the wrong gender, they were the wrong ethnic background, because what we were trying to do was mirror the population with our sample size so we had the truest picture. So when we go and collect the data, it's not as easy as finding 100 people and just asking them a question. You've got to find the right 100 people. And you've got to make sure that they represent your entire population or your research is skewed. and the results you're going to get are not very actionable, and if you do action on them, make a decision, you might make the wrong decision. Okay, once you've got the data, you analyze it using a program like SPSS. Some of us in early stages will use Excel. What we're looking for are means, we want to do cross tabulations. How many women said this? How many men said this? How many consumers between the ages of 35 and 44 said something else? We want to do the cross tabs. We want to do the means. What's the mean score in this particular area? What's the standard deviation? We're looking for a nice tight standard deviation, okay? Once we've got that, we prepare a report and we send that off to management. Now, in today's market, we probably don't prepare a written report as much as we put together a PowerPoint slide deck and we present that to management. And once that goes in, we follow it up. We follow it up usually by a tracking study to make sure that what we said is actually true. So we'll go through and we'll sample more people and find out where they're at in order to come to the proper conclusions. When you're establishing your study, it's important to keep in mind the difference between the problem and the objective. The problem is very information oriented. Okay? The objective is a goal statement. So our objective is to figure out, is there a market for a product, if that's what we're stating. Okay? The problem is, how do we collect the necessary information to figure out how big the market is, how much they'll spend, how often they'll buy, because all of that goes into the size of the market. So keep in mind those two things, because we'll often state the objective, and then we've got to figure out the problem underneath it to properly structure the research study, okay? The last thing I want to talk about in this particular video is secondary data. Secondary data is crucial to any research study. And essentially, what secondary data is something that was collected by somebody else for a similar or a different purpose, but will give us direction on where we want to go in our particular study. Okay? It can save you a lot of time and money if you use secondary research. And there are companies out there like Frost & Sullivan, Accenture, PricewaterhouseCoopers that collect this information all the time and will sell it to you. Sometimes it's very expensive, but sometimes what you can do is buy the table of contents, which will give you an idea about what they did. You can buy the executive summary, which really gives you an idea of what they're doing. And that's much less expensive than buying or fielding a research study. Okay? Be careful though. There are quality issues. Sometimes the data isn't perfect. Okay? Make sure it's properly referenced. If it's not properly referenced, I don't know if it's going to give you adequate data for what you're looking for with an accuracy level that makes it useful to you. Keep in mind that we're using more and more social media data in secondary research now. So we're taking secondary research from a place like Frost & Sullivan and combining it with Facebook's data or Google Analytics to get a better idea. Make sure that those data sets link properly. But that secondary data coming from social media is becoming much more important, especially as we get into those Gen Zers or Zers, sorry, it's Gen Zers. My Canadian was showing for a minute, and the millennials. And last but not least, keep in mind we're coming into the era of big data. I'm sure you've heard that. Big data takes into account the Internet of Things. It takes into account all that data we're collecting on people and our ability to go in and slice and dice it so it gives us useful information, okay? What you want to do is figure out what happened with big data. It's not a good example of why it happened. So if you're going to use big data, remember it'll tell you the what's, not so much the whys. The whys you'll probably have to field a primary study for. Okay, that's it on this section. When we come back, we're going to talk about planning the research study and primary data.